So when we're trying to name ionic compounds according to IUPAC, there is a certain system. Now, this system is quite simple. All names of ionic compounds have two parts, because all ionic compounds are made from two parts. Every ionic compound is made up of a cation and an anion. So the naming rules for ionic compounds are simple. There's really two main rules. So the first one is, we start by name the cation first, using the element's name. This is usually a metal ion. Now the second rule, or the second step, is we're going to name the anion second. Using the element's name, but we're going to end it in I. So it's these two rules that are key in naming our ionic compounds. So let's look at some examples. One that we're most familiar with is table salt. That's NaCl. That exists at a solid room temperature. So we have NaCl. Now if you know the name of table salt, right, you can go straight to it, but we can look at that first. Let's look at it according to our naming rule. So first we're going to name the cation. So the cation is going to be the metal, and the metal is sodium. So first we're going to name the cation, and the cation in this example is sodium. So I start by writing sodium. Now after that, what I need to do is I need to name the anion second. So the anion is chlorine, but we're going to end it in "ide." Now the nonmetals, when they're anions, we call them ide ions, right, or chloride ions. So in this case, we have, instead of chlorine, we would write chloride. So when we name NaCl, we call it sodium chloride. So let's look at another example. So let's say we have BaF2. Now again, it's an ionic compound. It is solid at room temperature. So we need to start with our first rule, name the cation first. Well, what is that cation? That's barium. Then we move to our second rule, name the anion second. The anion is fluorine, and we're going to end it in "ide." So we call this barium fluoride. Now let's do one more example. If we have K3N, my cation is potassium, and my anion is nitrogen. So it's a nitride ion, nitride. Potassium nitride. Now oftentimes you'll be given the opposite case, where you're given the name of the compound, the ionic compound, but you need to find the formula. So there are some rules to that. There's a couple more because it's a little bit more complicated than just naming. So first what we need to do is identify the ions in the compound and their charges. So we need to know what compounds are there, as well as what are their charges. Now the second step is we need to determine the total charges to balance. Then we will note the ratio of cations to anions. And then we use subscripts to write the formula if needed. So let's again just start with our common friendly example of sodium chloride. Well, first what we need to do is we need to identify the ions in the compound and their charges. So sodium, that has a charge of 1 plus, and then we have chlorine, and that has a charge of 1 minus. Now, determine the total charges needed to balance. Well, we want to make sure this is balanced because an ionic compound is not going to have a charge. So our positive ions should be able to cancel out our negative ions, and vice versa. Now we have 1 positive, 1 negative, so those are going to cancel out just fine. So we don't need to do any balancing. So our ratio is 1 to 1. So now we can write it just as NaCl. And we don't need any subscripts because we only have 1 sodium for 1 chloride ion. But what if we have an example like aluminum chloride? Well, let's start with aluminum. Aluminum has a charge of 3 plus, and chlorine has a minus 1 minus. This means we have 3 positive and 1 negative, and we need these to balance. So, in order to cancel out these 3 positives, we need at least 3 negatives. That means we need at least 3 chloride ions in order for this ionic compound to be put together properly. So, that means that I just need 1 aluminum, but I need 3 chloride ions. So in order to show this, we use subscripts. So we have aluminum, chloride. So this means I have 1 aluminum, because you can imagine I have a subscript of 1, but we don't write that because it is redundant. And I have 3 chloride ions, so AlCl3.